When risk work is done well, the hardest part is often not finding the issues, but translating what you found into documentation that a leader can confidently stand behind when questions get pointed and time gets short. Beginners sometimes imagine documentation as a formal record that sits in a folder, but in real organizations, risk documentation becomes a shield and a compass at the same time. It is a shield because it protects the organization and the decision-makers by showing that choices were deliberate, informed, and aligned with agreed criteria. It is a compass because it keeps everyone oriented when priorities shift, staff rotate, or an incident forces quick action and people need to know what was decided and why. The phrase leaders will defend is important because leadership is not just signing a piece of paper. They are attaching their credibility to the claim that the system's risk posture is understood and managed. If your documentation is vague, inconsistent, or missing rationale, leaders cannot defend it, and that makes future decisions more political and less evidence-based. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Strong risk documentation begins with a clear statement of purpose and scope that feels written for a busy human rather than for a compliance robot. A leader needs to understand what system this document is about, what was included, and what was deliberately excluded, because that boundary shapes every conclusion. It also helps to include a short description of why the system exists and what outcomes it supports, since risk is always relative to mission and data value. Even for beginners, this is a key point. Documenting risk is not only describing danger, it is describing the relationship between the system's purpose and the harms that could interfere with that purpose. When the scope is unclear, readers unconsciously fill gaps with their own assumptions, and then disagreements appear later when those assumptions collide. A good scope statement makes dependencies visible, such as external identity services or vendor platforms, without pretending that out of scope means irrelevant. That clarity allows leaders to defend decisions by pointing to the agreed frame rather than arguing from memory. After scope, the document must set context by naming the assumptions and decision criteria that govern the evaluation, because this is where defensibility is won or lost. A leader cannot defend a risk rating if they cannot explain what it was based on, and a reader cannot trust the document if it hides the conditions that make the conclusions true. Assumptions might include expected patch timelines, expected monitoring coverage, expected user roles, or expected vendor support behavior. Decision criteria might include what impacts are unacceptable, what downtime is tolerable, and what data exposures require escalation. If your organization uses enterprise risk management, (ERM), aligning the criteria with that governance language makes it easier for leadership to compare security risks with other risks they manage. The key is to express criteria in plain language that still preserves precision, so the document reads like an engineered argument rather than a list of slogans. When criteria are explicit, leaders can defend decisions as consistent application of policy, not as personal preference. The next ingredient is how you write findings, because a finding that is technically accurate can still be useless if it is written as a mystery or as an accusation. A defensible finding states what was observed, where it was observed, and why it matters, without dramatizing or guessing motives. It also connects the observation to a plausible risk chain, such as how a weakness could be triggered by an event and lead to impact. Beginners often write findings as labels, like weak access control, but leaders need a fuller picture, such as which access boundary is weak, what actions could be taken if it is exploited, and what kind of harm could follow. The tone matters too, because documentation that sounds like blame triggers defensiveness and reduces cooperation, while documentation that sounds like engineering invites problem-solving. When you write findings, you are building a case that can be reviewed and challenged, so grounding statements in observable evidence is essential. Evidence-based writing makes the organization's response more credible because it shows the risk assessment was not based on fear or guesswork. Defensible documentation also distinguishes between conditions, risks, and consequences because readers get confused when these are mixed into one mushy paragraph. A condition is the current state, like a missing safeguard or a dependency that is unmonitored. The risk is the possibility that something harmful could occur because of that condition, often described through threat, event, and vulnerability relationships. The consequence is the impact if the risk becomes real, such as loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, and the downstream mission effects. When you separate these, the document becomes easier to reason about and easier to defend, because disagreements can be located precisely. A leader might accept that the condition exists but disagree with the estimated likelihood, or accept the likelihood but argue the impact is lower because compensating processes exist. Those are productive disagreements that can be resolved with more evidence, and they are only possible when the writing is structured and clear. This is how you prevent risk documentation from becoming an emotional argument about whether something feels scary. Another essential feature is explicit treatment decisions, because leaders defend choices, not just observations. For each significant risk, the document should state whether the plan is to mitigate, avoid, transfer, or accept, and it should state why that treatment matches the decision criteria and constraints. The why is what allows defensibility, because a leader may need to explain why a risk was accepted temporarily, why a mitigation was chosen over a redesign, or why a project was paused until a control was implemented. A treatment decision without rationale looks arbitrary, and arbitrariness is difficult to defend under scrutiny. Good rationale links back to mission needs, feasible timelines, cost and staffing realities, and the effectiveness of proposed controls. It also makes clear whether the decision is conditional, such as acceptance only until a certain milestone is reached or only under certain operating conditions. Conditional decisions are common in real engineering work, and documenting them clearly prevents temporary exceptions from becoming permanent blind spots. To make documentation usable, you must connect each treatment decision to specific actions and owners, because unowned risk is risk that drifts. Leaders need to know who is responsible for completing a mitigation and who is responsible for verifying it works, since those are often different roles. The document should also include a timeline expectation that is realistic, because a mitigation plan with no time anchor turns into a vague promise. This is where new learners sometimes worry they are being too demanding, but assigning ownership and expected completion dates is not a punishment. It is how systems improve. It also makes later reviews faster, because you can see what was supposed to happen and what actually happened. When leaders defend risk posture, they often point to the plan and the accountability structure as evidence that risk is being managed responsibly. Without that structure, leadership is left defending hope, and hope is not a strong argument in a high-stakes review. Defensible documentation must also handle uncertainty honestly, because pretending to know what you do not know is a fast way to lose trust. Security risk decisions often rely on incomplete information, such as partial asset inventories, incomplete visibility into vendor components, or uncertain threat behavior. The goal is not to halt decisions until perfect data exists, but to label uncertainty and describe how it affects confidence in the conclusions. A strong document might explain that a risk rating assumes full monitoring coverage, and that the rating should be revisited if monitoring gaps are discovered. It might also identify specific unknowns and propose actions to reduce uncertainty, such as validating logging from a component or confirming the scope of an integration. Leaders can defend decisions made under uncertainty if the uncertainty was disclosed and managed, because that shows intellectual honesty and responsible governance. In contrast, if uncertainty is hidden and later revealed by an incident, the documentation becomes a liability rather than a defense. A key reason leaders struggle to defend security documentation is that it sometimes fails to connect technical control language to mission language, leaving a translation gap. Your document should connect major risks to outcomes leadership cares about, such as service disruption, delayed mission workflows, legal exposure, or loss of trust, while still preserving the technical truth about how those outcomes could occur. This is not about turning security into business buzzwords. It is about making the causal chain understandable at multiple levels. If you describe a privilege management weakness, explain what it could allow someone to do and which mission function that could disrupt. If you describe a monitoring gap, explain how it affects time to detect and why that increases impact. This kind of writing helps leaders defend the assessment because they can explain it to non-technical audiences without distorting it. The best documents make it easy for a leader to retell the story accurately, which is a subtle but powerful test of quality. Consistency of terms and ratings is another major part of defensibility, because inconsistent language invites criticism that the process is subjective. If one section uses high and another uses critical without defining the difference, readers will question the rigor. If one risk is described with clear likelihood reasoning and another is described only with adjectives, the document feels uneven. A strong approach is to define how likelihood and impact are interpreted, then apply that interpretation consistently across findings. This does not require fancy scoring systems, but it does require discipline in phrasing and in linking statements to evidence. Consistency also applies to how controls are described, so readers can see when a control is fully implemented, partially implemented, or planned. When leaders defend documentation, they often defend the process as much as the result, and consistency is what makes the process look deliberate. A document that reads like it was assembled from mismatched fragments is hard to defend because it signals that judgments may have been ad hoc. Risk posture is not only about what is wrong, so defensible documentation should include a clear statement of what is working and what protections are already effective. Beginners sometimes think including strengths will weaken the urgency of fixing problems, but in practice, acknowledging effective controls increases credibility. It shows that the assessment is balanced and that the team is capable of recognizing evidence in both directions. It also helps leaders understand which controls are worth sustaining and which investments are paying off, which is essential when budgets are tight and priorities compete. The document can describe key safeguards, such as strong identity governance, effective monitoring practices, or reliable recovery routines, and explain how these reduce likelihood or impact for specific risks. This also supports leadership defense because they can describe a coherent posture, not just a list of failures. A posture narrative that includes both strengths and gaps feels more like engineering and less like accusation. Another core idea is traceability, meaning the document should make it possible to connect findings to requirements and decisions to criteria so the logic can be audited. Traceability is not about adding complexity. It is about preventing the document from becoming a set of isolated statements. If a requirement exists to protect certain data, then risks affecting that data should be connected to that requirement and to the mission outcome it supports. If a decision criterion says certain impacts are unacceptable, then risks with those impacts should clearly show why the chosen treatment meets that criterion. When traceability is present, leaders can defend the outcome by pointing to the chain from mission to requirement to finding to treatment decision. Without traceability, critics can claim the assessment is arbitrary, and it becomes hard to respond because the reasoning is not visible. Traceability also helps future teams because they can see how the system's current posture was derived and what assumptions held at the time. Defensible documentation must also be written with the expectation that it will be read after something goes wrong, because that is often when documentation gets its most intense scrutiny. After an incident, people ask what was known, what was decided, and whether decisions were reasonable. If your document clearly recorded major risks, treatment choices, and conditions for acceptance, it can demonstrate that leadership acted responsibly even if an event still occurred. If the document is vague, it can look like the organization was unaware or careless, even if the team did real work. This is why clarity and evidence matter so much, and why you should avoid sweeping claims like the system is secure or the risk is eliminated. Instead, describe the posture as managed and bounded by specific controls and assumptions. When you write with post-incident scrutiny in mind, you naturally produce language that is more careful, more specific, and more defendable. That carefulness is not fear, it is professional rigor. The final step is to ensure the document ends with a synthesized posture statement that leaders can actually repeat, because a defensible document should produce a clear takeaway. That synthesis should capture the top risk drivers, the most important mitigations in place, the main residual risks that remain, and the decisions made about those residuals. It should also highlight the next actions that will most improve posture and the conditions that would trigger reassessment, such as major changes in scope or new critical vulnerabilities and dependencies. The synthesis is where leadership confidence is built, because it shows the assessment resulted in understanding, not just in paperwork. When findings and decisions are turned into risk documentation with clear scope, explicit assumptions, consistent criteria, evidence-based findings, and accountable treatment plans, leaders can defend the posture as a reasoned position rather than as a hopeful claim. That is the purpose of risk documentation in security engineering. It makes decisions explainable, repeatable, and resilient under pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.